How's it going? Got a couple tips and tricks for you in 3 different areas. So I'm going to throw a number of random things at you to give you some ideas for this season to hopefully go faster and potentially understand your numbers or think about your business in just a little bit different way. There's so much I could give you, so it's going to be a bit random, but we're going to essentially cover some estimating concepts, some pricing concepts, and I'm going to tie back to a video that I did a few weeks ago and give you a couple team accountability ideas. And I'm going to put it all into this one video. So I had a video a few weeks back, and the video was right here, job cost, how much should I charge for a lawn? And I'd recommend you take a look at that video. If I bring up this spreadsheet right here, you might recognize this if you watched that video. And the gist of it was that you really want to get to a place where you're tracking your time at the beginning of the job all the way up until the end of the job. That gives you your total time on the job. You then multiply that by the number of individuals that were working the job, and you divide that by how much you build that job at. So if you build it at $40 or $80 or $150, you divide that time into that money, and it will give you a per man hour rate, which is absolutely critical. An additional component of that is something called budgeted time, which is really important for profitability as well as managing the team. And so I'm going to talk about that as well. So you might refer back to that video to help jog your memory, because this will sort of build on it, and I'm going to throw just a whole number of things at you. So first I want to talk about estimating. Before we even talk about pricing, I want you to think about something regarding estimating. So I'm going to show you something from a webinar a while back, and here's just a concept. You can take it or you can leave this concept, but I want to share an idea with you. So whether you realize it or you don't, you are, whenever your phone rings, whenever someone fills out a web form, whenever somebody calls you and leaves a voicemail, whenever someone emails you, messages you on Facebook Messenger, sends you a text message if you publish a number, these items are sort of represented here in this graphic. Whenever that happens, that begins the process, your estimate workflow process, meaning the entirety of the process that you or a team member has to go through to eventually get the buyer to say, yep, I want to work with you, essentially close the deal, sign the contract, whatever the situation is for you. So when you're thinking about moving quick, when you're thinking about growing fast, when you're thinking about closing the highest number of potential leads, one of the things to think about, and this is where I'm just throwing out some tips and tricks, is to understand how advanced, how complicated, how many steps are in a normal process. Whether you realize it or not, because you're just going through the motions and your team's going through the motions, there's a ton of steps. And so I'm going to go really fast here. So a message comes in. If you answer the phone live, then you are immediately at a moment in time where it's like, hey, do you want to quote, yes or no? I'm skipping all kinds of steps in the conversation you'd have with the prospect. And if they want to quote, then you need to either figure out, am I going to quote this work over the phone? Am I going to go out and visit the property? Okay. If they don't want to quote, then you either have to determine, do I want to market to this company in the future, or do I want to never market to them again? If you want to market to them in the future, then you want to have some means to track who this prospect was that didn't close, potentially what they're interested in, so that you can market to them in the future and make them a client someday down the road. You don't want to just say, well, that's a bummer that it didn't work out. And so you need a system or some means of tracking that lead, they called about mowing, they called about irrigation, they called about fertilization, weed control, so that you can market those services to them later at exactly the right moment. All right, so we have this thing in Service Autopilot called automations that can do that. They can look and say, oh, you still want this client? Great. And it can market to them at just the right time of the year to try to win their business, because you don't want to waste all that money that you spent bringing that lead in. Just because they said no today doesn't mean they'll say no a few months from now. So that would be one tip. Really think about some means of tracking that lead so that you can get them later, and you figure out later what they'll want at the exact time of year that they'll want it, you go get them. So if you continue through this workflow process, that's what happens if they're not interested. Now, here's the big thing. What normally happens is when they call, they often go to voicemail, or they email, or they fill out a web form. So what happens is you then have to get them back on the phone. If you look at all the data, most companies only try once, maybe twice to reconnect with the prospect that sent in a request or left a voicemail. And it's very difficult often, as you know, to get them back on the phone or get them to connect. It doesn't mean they're not interested. They're just busy like you're busy. Therefore, we hardly follow up. And as a result, we never connect with them. And so if you think about the process, just the tediousness of the back and forth follow-up before you can connect, that's just phase one of the estimate process. At the moment in time where you finally connect with them and they say, yes, I want an estimate, then you get down here into this bottom right part, which is phase two. And this is actually now generating the estimate, potentially going to the property, generating a price on the phone, meeting with them in person, whatever the scenario. And then often, even after the estimate's been generated, the whole back and forth trying to connect so you can actually give them the verbal quote or follow up on the estimate that was left on their door or mailed to them or emailed to them or whatever your process was, or maybe you met with them in person, you gave them the quote and they said, let me talk to my spouse, or I've got 3 other bids, let me get back to you. Then there's the whole game that ensues thereafter where you have to connect with them. You got to get back on the phone. There are a million steps in this process, and every one of those is a potential failure point. Tip number 2 would be to consider this. Whenever you're looking at a process that is happening inside your organization, I understand that if you're smaller, this may seem advanced, but this is how you get big, to think this way. How could you circumvent the entire process and make certain steps unnecessary? So one of the things that was a massive win for us was that we staffed so we could answer the phone live when we were teeny tiny, like hardly doing any revenue. We then got a backup answering service. What happened is it allowed us to answer the phone live, and when we couldn't answer the phone live, an answering service answered live, therefore they actually captured the information, we immediately called back, like as fast as we could. So by getting them on the phone, we next figured out, what if we could just sell them on the phone? And what happened is, if you can get them on the phone, you can price them over the phone, you can sell them over the phone, you can get an answer right there. You literally never encompass any other step in this process. You never encompass all this stuff over here on the left. You never go into phase 2. You touch on pieces of phase 2. You miss all that stuff. That's a game changer. Okay, so that's tip number 2. Just think about that concept. I know I'm giving you a lot. Now, how in the world do you do such a thing? Well, one of the ways you do such a thing is also remember the game is speed. And I understand you might be doing small residential, you might be doing big commercial, big residential. Some of what I'm going to say may not apply to you. Don't discount it, don't throw it out. Think about, is there a way that I could apply some of this to my business? Is it just a way for me to think differently and challenge the way I'm doing things? I'm not saying everything I'm telling you will work for you because we all run slightly different businesses, but the wins are in discovering how you can apply what others are doing to your business to gain efficiencies and speed. So I just gave you a speed example. We circumvent and eliminate the majority of the steps by answering the phone live, selling right on the phone. How do you sell live on the phone? This may or may not work for your business, but it'll work for a ton of companies. So you're looking for a data point. So for example, we figured out for us that gross lot square footage is a data point that allows us to sell mowing. And it happens to, and it works especially well for us because we have figured out where we perceive the best clients are for us, and we only serve those areas and we ignore everybody else. So we serve a lot of very similar sized properties. They vary in size, but they're very similar. Yes, some will have lots of trees, and yes, some will have terraces or levels, and that can add a difficulty factor, but the majority of the clients, it's as simple as just knowing gross lot square footage. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but we found gross lot square footage to be the magic ticket there. Then when you get into things like fertilization, weed control, year-long ant treatments, grub treatments, aeration, things of that sort, the magic number was turf square footage. Then if you get into irrigation, oftentimes it's the count of the irrigation zones or something of that sort. Then for something like pest control, it's probably the square footage of the home. Could be number of rooms, but there's a magic number there that you only need to know that number, and with it you can eventually figure out pricing. Takes some work to figure out those numbers. Takes some work to figure out on average what you should charge for a 7,000 gross lot square foot property, or a 5,400 square foot turf square foot property, or a 3,200 square foot house, but you can find those averages eventually. And when you do the work, it's magic because then you can sell right over the phone. All you have to ask is, how many dogs do you have? You can sell the pooper scooper business. How many? You can then calculate in something like Service Autopilot, looking at the mapping feature. So I'll just show you, I'm not, my broader point here, I'm going to show you a couple Service Autopilot things, not so much to show Service Autopilot, more to talk about things that you could do. So for example, in Service Autopilot, I can just go into a property here and I can literally just measure off the property, get all the square footage. I'm just going to make this crazy simple. Like that's not very well done there, but it will automatically calculate the square footage. When I save this, it will automatically save it to gross lot square footage or turf or whatever I'd like it to do, and it memorizes all this forever, but it automatically saves all that data so that it can automatically figure out pricing. You can do this however you want. We do not have the lock on being unique in that we're the only ones that can calculate square footages and all kinds of data from a mapping system. We can do that, and you can turn on satellite images and all that kind of stuff and do this, and there's other companies that do it with airplane imagery. Not a new concept here, but in doing this and then saving this number, this data, you can automatically price over the phone, and that's essentially what we did. And what it does is it allows you then to price very fast. The game is speed. People want to get this thing off their to-do list. The other thing is, by pricing over the phone, going back to my example, you were able to miss all of these steps. So it was another advantage. The other thing is, by coming up with some and this is really the gist of what I'm talking about, how can you find just an incredibly simple way to price so that when you price in such a simple fashion, you can teach your team to do it so you are not trapped. A lot of owners get trapped in their business because they don't feel comfortable ever handing off the estimating, the bidding. How can you eventually get bush trimming down to counting certain types of bushes, small rounds, medium rounds, large rounds, hedgerows, linear footage of hedgerows? How can you, it takes some work, but once you figure out that data and you figure out some key numbers to price tree trimming on, or irrigation, or pest control, or fertilization, weed control, or aeration, or any of those services by just getting a couple data points, then you can totally turn this into a system. So I'll give you another example to kind of get your brain thinking. So let's just imagine, so like for example, I'm going to go to a client here. I'm going to go into this client. This is just Service Autopilot. I'm going to point out a couple things just to give you an idea. So if I were to go into an estimate, I'm about to give you another tip. This is just an estimate. Don't get too caught up in it. I'm not really showing it to explain it. So I'm going to go right here and I'm just going to pick templates. And this is kind of a play account that I have. So I have no idea what kind of crazy stuff we'll see in here. So this is an example of, I know this is a residential client, so I can bring up a template of everything that I'm probably going to sell to this residential client. And based on some square footages that are already saved in the system, that it can automatically calculate pricing. So for example, it knows if for this client, they're a weekly client, that they're going to be $32. So this is a little tiny residential property. It knows we're going to take care of them 34 times a year. If they're bi-weekly, it's going to be a $38 property. We're going to take care of them 18 times a year. It knows this stuff, okay? And I can go in and add difficulty factors. I can do all this other stuff. Here's the next tip. And this is why I'm using kind of Service Autopilot, just to prompt me to remind you of some tips. All right, so now imagine where a lot of your cost is. You roll a truck, and you have to go out and do an estimate, and the client's like, hey, what's it going to cost to do mowing? So you roll the truck, you go out there and you give them a price for mowing. While you're out there, you've already spent a lot of money to get the person to the property. Maybe it's your time to do the estimate. While you're there, why not go ahead and look at the property, take the measurements, and bring up some, like whatever your estimating system is, and go ahead and have some means of tracking it. So for example, maybe I don't have the square footage in here, and so I just look at it, or I'd rather you put in the square footage and have the square footage calculate your pricing, but maybe this is $43. You were out there, you figured out pest control is $85. I don't know what this is, somebody playing around here. So in this ant treatment, maybe it's 110. I'm getting to a point, you'll understand it here in a moment. We'll go with that. So you do an irrigation inspection on this property, it's whatever your price is. The mulch, you went ahead and measured the beds. You can come over here and add notes. So I can add notes to this account with all the details. I could put in square footages and save them forever of the beds so that we can calculate it out. It could calculate mulch if you know how many yards or cubic feet you'll need. It could calculate the pricing. But let's just keep it real simple and say you calculated it's $400 to do mulch. And that was at 3 inches deep versus 2. You went through all the surfaces you sold. And here's the point. You're walking the property. You've got a tech there. You've already spent the money. So while they're there for another 10 minutes, they could go ahead and estimate everything. Here's the idea. You then store all that data in your system. Miss Smith calls 3 weeks from now and says, you know what? I'm really happy with the mowing. Could you guys also do this? All you got to do is go into the system, pop up the estimate, and look at it and say, yep, we can do that. It's only $85. Or I could even go in here, and let's say she called about pest control. I've got all this data stored in my system. I can just quickly hit quote on this. I can go right up here to the top, Actually, I'm showing you more than necessary. I can just hit send, I can blast her an email, and it will save all this data. And I'm asking you to find a way to do this in your system, or of course, use Service Autopilot. But my point here is that then the system would just send Miss Smith a quote for just pest control, but it would save all this other data that's saved as draft, and it wouldn't send out any of that pricing. The broader point here, the tip is, I don't care what system you use. It could be a spreadsheet, but if you're going to go out to the property, go ahead and estimate everything. Go ahead and measure the flower beds for mulch. Go ahead and figure out, measure for color. Go ahead and look at and inspect the property. Do an audit, record all the pricing. That way, when they call in later and they want a price, you don't have to roll a truck. You can sell it right there over the phone. So that's another tip. So that's when you get into estimating. And there's another point I want to talk about. So this kind of rolls now into pricing. And so, I know I'm moving fast, sort of off the top of my head. So now think about pricing. Let me just let me show you something here to set this up. Client calls in, they want to sign up for mowing, and so I'm going to go in, and I know we're going to put them on a Friday schedule, and they want weekly mowing. So let me just type in weekly here real quick. I'm going to pick weekly. The system's smart enough to automatically calculate their price based on whatever your metric is for pricing, and also it knows the budgeted time. Okay. So the reason I want to do this is going to lead me into something on budgeted time, not pricing so much yet. Remember, we were talking a while back about this. We were talking about tracking time and figuring out your pricing. So you can refer back to that Lawn Care Millionaire video. We were talking about figuring out your pricing by square footage. It's magic. All right, so the other thing you get from figuring out your pricing by square footage is it's one of the things I just showed you in estimating. System can automatically then calculate your pricing. Also, the thing you get from this is you start to understand what your budgeted time is. So what I'm going to do in a future Lawn Care Millionaire video is I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you this whole calculator here at the bottom and show you how to figure out your pricing. And I'm going to link in a buddy of mine. We're going to do a video, and we're going to talk about overhead, cost of goods sold, and pricing. I'm sorry, profit. So watch for that video coming so you understand how to price, how to think about your numbers so that you can put your pricing together. The point is, at the end of the day, it starts with understanding some means of pricing, such as, in my example, gross lot square footage here. Okay, I get a price from that. But the other thing I can start to figure out is budgeted time. So to produce, let's just call it $40. If I'm trying to bill out, if it's a $40 job and I'm billing at $40 a man hour, then that means I can spend one total hour on that job. Okay, so that gets into this thing called budgeted time. And the reason I'm going down this road is another tip. So what happens is when you have budgeted time, meaning that you go out and you bid a job and you look at it, or you have a system for bidding it, you say this job is going to take 1 hour. And back to my example, as a company, you want to make $40 per man hour when you're billing time. Then you know you need to charge $40 for that job. If it's going to take 1.5 hours, you know you need to charge $60 for that job. So at the end of the day, all bidding is based on thinking about time and then multiplying the time against your hourly billing rate. So you might sell mowing at $45 a man hour. You might sell irrigation at $85 a man hour. You've got a number in which you want to sell time. That's the business we're in. So you are first, whenever you're bidding bushes, irrigation work, fertilization, weed control, aeration, whatever it is, it all starts with understanding how long it's going to take, and that's the beginning of establishing a price. Well, if you've established a price based on time, then you should be saving that budgeted time. You should be storing it. Here's why. So what we do is, if you say this job is going to take 1 hour, then what happens is, I'll hold up my mobile device. If you are looking at the mobile app for Service Autopilot and you've got a crew out there on the job site, now let's say today 2 guys are working the job and it's a 1 hour job, then it's going to show that they have 30 minutes. 1 total man hour divided by the 2 men working the job. We can be on the property for 30 minutes. And the mobile app is going to literally count down and say you've got 20 minutes left. You've got 18 minutes left to get this job done. If they were to show up, it's a 1 hour job, and today we're running a 3-man crew, the mobile app figures out there's 3 men, so I've got 20 minutes to work the job, and it does a countdown from 20 minutes and tells them where they're at. This is accountability. So I mentioned I was going to talk about team accountability. Well, one way I talk about team accountability, like you could talk about pay for performance, all these other things. Well, one way to get accountability is to tell them what the goal is. The goal is you have 20 minutes on the property, and you have 20 minutes to work this job, and to hold them accountable to that time. So in that case, you might refer back to this video here, which was, are you rewarding your worst lawn care employees? Well, as you watch that video, think about this little example. One way to get some level of accountability is to tell them what the goal is and then hold them accountable to the goal. And when they go over the budgeted time, that's an indicator to you that you need to have a conversation. See, did something change on the property? So you might think from there, this is just another tip. That's a big tip. You should have budgeted time on every one of your jobs because it establishes a goal. If you don't have it, then what is the goal for them to be working to? What are you holding them accountable to? Do they even know that they're failing? They're not moving fast enough. The only way they can know that is if you told them this is how much time is allowed on this job based on the way we bid the work. Okay, so then you might think to yourself, well, that's a bit of a dilemma. So here in this system, the system's smart enough that when I pick weekly mowing, it knows in this market or for this client that means 34 cuts per year and automatically schedules 34 cuts. It starts bi-weekly, goes into weekly, finishes out the season at bi-weekly, and then goes into a number of months off season that makes up for the 34 cuts. Here's the other thing that happens with budgeted time. That's a tip you might want to keep in mind. So like what you can do is you can go into our system, and this is more of a point than showing you this. I can go to edit budgeted time. So the reality is when you think about managing your teams and setting a goal, it might be that they have 1 man hour on the job, but in spring when it's raining and the grass is growing real quick, you're getting some surge growth there at the beginning of the year, it very well might be that you're going to give them, I'm just going to be real simple here, I'm going to give them 1 hour and I'm putting this in as a decimal, so let me just do it that way. I'm going to give them 1 hour and 1.25. That's without going into details, it's an hour and 15 minutes. All right, so, and then I'm going to say from 3:1 until 4:15, we'll call that spring, and they get a little bit more time. So in this case, what the system's doing is it's automatically on their mobiles and everywhere else, giving them more time to work that job in the springtime because it's growing faster. And then automatically after 4:15, it will go back to defaulting to just giving them their normal time. In my example, 1 hour. All right, you kind of get the idea. So think about that too as you're setting a goal for your team. Don't forget about the spring factor. Don't forget about certain times of the year where there will be a variance in the amount of time it takes to perform the work. You've got to give them a goal. One more random idea, a tip, okay? A tip would be, let's imagine this. So are you doing this? Doesn't have to be done in software, but phone rings, client says, hey, I'm getting a new fence installed. Hey, last week when your guys were out, they did a lousy job mowing behind the fence. Hey, last time your tech was out, he never followed up with me on the whatever issue. While you're on the phone, you don't have to do it in our system. I'm just going to show you a concept. You don't have to do it in our system, but you can do it in whatever system you have, and there's different ways to do it than what I'm about to show you. If I'm on the phone and the client says, hey, please don't mow behind the fence next week, I can go in and do this. I'm getting to a broader point, so stick with me here. Okay, so I put in the note, don't mow behind fence, and then what I'm gonna do is next week, I'm gonna put this on their schedule, and in my case, I'm gonna go ahead and block it out for the whole week, because while this job's scheduled for Friday, what if it rains and it gets kicked down to Saturday? I still want the note to show up. Here's my broader point. I'm just gonna have this show for lawn mowing. Are you doing this? And there's two things here. One, are you putting the notes into whatever system you're using, Google Calendar, whatever it is? As soon as you get off the phone with the client, you're automatically adding the notes to the system. And then every morning, are you making sure that your team is reviewing all of their notes? This is massive to customer service. This is massive to accountability. This is big in driving down redos and callbacks. The other thing to think about, if you are using some form of a system, we do expiration dates. Like for example, I could set this note out into the future, and they could say, hey, we're going to be on vacation out in the future on these dates, and we could be having a conversation right now in March, and it pertains to a month from now. I could put the note in, and it doesn't start showing till a month from now, and then it stops showing by the end of the week. Here's the logic. How often is it that your team, and this is the idea, how often is that your team is going out and you do give them notes? You do put notes on their route sheets, you put notes that show up on their mobile devices, you do all of that stuff. But what happens is, because the notes just keep accumulating week after week after week, or maybe you put a note on there early because this thing's going to be coming up in a couple weeks, and so you're training the behavior of the crew to not even bother reading the notes, because half the notes on the sheet are old. So we solved that problem in technology. You quite possibly are not using Service Autopilot or a means of doing this. So I would highly recommend, based on what we've learned from a customer service standpoint, quality standpoint, go back and spend the time and clean those notes off the spreadsheets because or off your route sheets or whatever system you're using, because if you don't, they will eventually ignore all the notes and it doesn't work. And that's why we built the functionality in to automatically remove the notes after some date. That way it will automatically clean it up. So if we go out and we inspect a property and the team is doing a terrible job edging, then we might have a note that runs on the sheet or on the mobile, better said, for 3 weeks, reminding them to get that part right, reminding them the client's watching that. And then after 3 weeks, it just automatically falls off. So that's probably tip 5 or 6 or whatever tip number I'm on now. Go through your system, your spreadsheet, whatever system you're using, and clean up those notes. Well, one, make sure you're using notes because it's massive. We live by notes. It's very, very important. Then talk to your teams, make sure they're reading them, hold them accountable to reading them, just like you're holding them accountable to budgeted time. And then on top of that, clean those notes out so that you don't train a behavior where they just quit paying attention. I feel like I've given you quite a few tips and tricks. So in the future here, watch for a video to help you calculate pricing, and then watch for a video that gets into figuring out how to price based on a very brief understanding of overhead, cost of goods sold, and profit. See you soon.